I have some related videos I've been doing looking at the great man theory versus people's theory versus elite theory. I'm not going to say it's a direct continuation using certain phraseology because YouTube algorithm will basically crush it if it thinks it's a multiple PART video. Now, the reason we're talking about these different theories is because if you weight them improperly, you get a wrong idea of what a country's capable of doing. Whereas if you have a better understanding, you can see what changes are actually possible in a country and which are unlikely. Okay, so I'm going to compare a little bit the Second American Revolution to the French Revolution because there are some good contrast between great man peoples and the elite history. What's the Second American Revolution? Some people call that the Civil War, but I disagree. I think the Civil War is its own thing. The Second American Revolution, in my opinion, is what most people call the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Because this was actually the establishment realigning to swap out the decentralized Articles of Confederation for a constitution with far more centralized government. During the Revolution, the establishment had split into three factions. The Tories, who wanted things to remain as they were, Unionists, who wanted to create a centralized government with an American parliament that answered directly to the king, and finally, those who wanted independence. The faction that wanted independence was insufficient to make things happen on their own, and with a split establishment, they needed allies. So they ended up allying with the rest of Western populations of their states and the minor nobility of the establishment, people who would have been fringe or not in the establishment at all, in order to pull it off. Now, this alliance ended up writing the Articles of Confederation, and the bulk of their movement did it the way they did it because they wanted strong independent states. Now, all the supposed shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation were in fact propaganda points from the eventually victorious Federalists. The Federalists wrote our history. Now, I'm not insinuating that the Articles of Confederation were superior to the Constitution, nor am I saying that we would have been better off with them. I'm just saying that uh, what we understand about them comes from the people who wanted to defeat it. The Articles of Confederation government was not unpopular with the people. It had defeated the British Empire. It was in the process of retiring most of the debt that had accumulated from the Revolutionary War. And for the most part, economic conditions were generally good. There was no popular groundswell to change the government. Federalist historians like to note how the Tories fled the US during and after the Revolutionary War. But what they don't talk about is that many of them came back as well. A lot of them were former members of the old establishment. Now, what this ended up doing was creating an imbalance because now you had former establishment members who, by all rights, could walk right back into the establishment due to the wealth, power, and positions they had. So this created an establishment rift. The old revolutionary establishment, which had formed up with minor Western leaders and populist sentiment, uh, decided they were no longer happy with this arrangement because they wanted a different style of government. So the old revolutionary establishment that had been the establishment before the revolution now reached out to the former Tories and the former Unionists in order to create a new establishment. Although this group of people as the elites were made up of critical people of the era, the big people of the era. None of these actually constituted a great man. They, in fact, worked tirelessly. Why am I having trouble with that word today? To get George Washington to force a new government on the people. Numerous requests were made to Washington by key establishment figures trying to get him to help them set up a new government, and George Washington rebuffed them all. Washington was too decent of a man to act against the will of the people. Washington ultimately was fed disinformation on Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was spun to him as a debtors' class war, which made him fear that the United States was going to head down the same path as France. By the way, you can quickly find out if you're dealing with a good Revolutionary War historian and a bad one. If they tell you Shays' Rebellion was a debtors' class war, you're dealing with a bad historian. If they realize it was a rebellion against corruption, then you're talking to someone who might know what they're talking about. So Washington was maneuvered by subterfuge to help hijack a convention that was designed to amend the Articles of Confederation. And this hijacking turned the convention into one where they ended up drawing up a whole new government. And this was not universally well received. A lot of attendants left the convention out of anger. So Massachusetts ended up being the linchpin. And they ended up pulling every underhanded political trick in the world in order to get their state convention to work the right way. The Constitution literally passed by only a handful of votes. And once Massachusetts passed it, the rest of the country was primed to start passing it. However, it's highly likely if Massachusetts had shot it down, everybody else would have shrugged it off, saying it's not worth continuing the effort to do this because without New England, what kind of country would it be? Now, it ended up setting the stage for the rest of the state conventions, and in this case, this event was entirely elite history. It was the establishment putting together a series of events to make this happen. Our great man, George Washington, didn't really act as a great man here. Yeah, other than the fact that he didn't try to take advantage of it. I mean, he was good, but he was not acting as a great man in terms of how great man theory looks at things. They used him to get what they wanted, but he wasn't the driving force. So the establishment created a very small George Washington-sized hole in the establishment for him to fit into. Now, Washington was a disinterested man. That's another term you should throw at any historian who's trying to tell you about the Revolutionary War. If they don't know what a disinterested man is, they don't know what they're talking about. Washington, as a disinterested man, occupied the exact space that the elite had intended for him and made no attempt to push out of it. Now, in a previous video, and at the beginning of this one, I talked a little bit about the French Revolution. The French Revolution is interesting because a lot of people want it to be something that it isn't. The French, modern day lefties and communists, like to romanticize this into a people's rebellion. In fact, this revolution is part of French creation mythology, which is another concept. Whenever you get into a country's creation mythology, it's very hard to convince people anything other than that as a fact because it's deeply ingrained. It's kind of like saying Genesis didn't happen. So for the French to paint it as anything other than a people's rebellion is in fact kind of anti-French. Prior to the events of the French Revolution, the French establishment had become brittle. Now, I haven't really performed enough research on the ideas of a brittle establishment, but I suspect a lot of it has to deal with how hard it is to get in. An establishment that's hard to get into probably can't change as events change. The French were having economic problems. and the establishment realized that their progress was at an impasse. They needed to change the system, but there was no clear agreement as to what they needed to do. The first major moves occurred around the Duc d'Orleans. And just to clarify, Duc d'Orleans is a title. This gentleman's name was Philippe. There were Duc d'Orleans before him and a few after him. There might even be one now. But I'm going to refer to him as Duc d'Orleans just for consistency and ease. Their family lineage made them direct contenders to the throne. Essentially, they were there as a fallback position. If for some reason the main line could not produce a male heir, they were there to fill the gap. A portion of the establishment formed up around the Duc d'Orleans and began a series of agitations that were definitely designed to destabilize the regime, possibly even overthrow it. We aren't sure what the exact goal was, but likely it was to create a constitutional monarchy more like England, with the Duc d'Orleans on the throne. Because the establishment did not firmly form around Duc d'Orleans, different forces were pulling in different directions, all at the same time. Some of the establishment wanted to keep the current king and everything exactly the way it was. Some of them were looking at having the king and having modest reform. Some were looking at having a king with radical reform. And then there were numerous different people with completely different ideas on republics. This is a clear instance of elite history. The elites were driving things. The establishment is causing the change. However, they failed to coalesce around a single plan of action. The storming of the Bastille, the Women's March, and all these other various events all have strong historical references showing them as being orchestrated. They were not in any way organic. Once these events reach their objective, you end up with a long period of inactivity where nothing happens. If this was truly a people's rebellion, the people would be pushing from event to event to event in rapid order. Whereas once the objective was met, everyone kind of went, okay, now what? Clearly, somebody wanted more to happen, and it didn't. This was not a people's rebellion. The Duc d'Orleans was a borderline great man because he did get things started, but he couldn't keep control. He got things in motion, but wasn't able to get the elite establishment to create a hole for him. In the end, he ended up trying to occupy a low position as a representative in Parliament and was ultimately executed for being a royal. Now, the ramping up to and the actual French Terror itself was the establishment in a desperate attempt to try to coalesce a faction and draw in allies to shore up their faction. Now, these allies were not establishment, and they very quickly turned on each other, realizing that there was no long term path to power for these people being establishment adjunct. So that's why they would basically lash out at other establishment factions in order to try to create holes for themselves. Eventually, the exhausted establishment ended up creating an opening for a king-like strongman. Napoleon ends up being the only person capable of doing this at the time this occurs. Now, when Napoleon first started, he was first citizen of the Republic. And over a matter of a couple of years, he ends up being emperor. And if you look at how the French establishment reacts to it and how the people react to it, it's pretty crystal clear that nobody really had strong aspirations for a republic. These aspirations for a republic came from the elite. The people pretty much accepted the idea that, okay, we're back to a monarchy like system and we're okay with it. So, another strike against the idea of people's rebellion. Now, I think that there's probably nobody who could have stepped into the hole the establishment created other than Napoleon. Now, looking at Napoleon himself, uh, going back to the Revolutionary period. He did great service in the field, helping keep the Republic alive. But at that time, there were others in similar roles, other generals putting up a good fight. While he was doing this, he did not create the opportunity to step into. Somebody else opened a hole for him. Without the elites creating the upheaval, Napoleon would have likely have been on a list of great generals in moderately consequential battles. In the end, Napoleon ended up being a reformist monarch. He changed a lot of things for the good in terms of reform, and that's something King Louis could have done if the establishment had let him. It's something that Duke d'Orleans could have done if the establishment would have rallied around him as king. Or to restate it clearly, if the elites had rallied around Louis, he could have been the reformed monarch. If the elites had rallied around Duke d'Orleans, he could have been the reformed monarch. Because they didn't, ultimately, Napoleon ends up being the reformed monarch. Now, ultimately, Napoleon even breaks out of that mold to become a great man. And again, great does not necessarily mean good. At the point he became monarch, the French establishment was essentially shattered. Uh, the Napoleon sized hole in the establishment was pretty large to start with, big enough to put a king in. But the walls of this hole were weak and very easy to push out on. Napoleon reconstituted the establishment by adding his own people to it. He then forged ahead with empire. Now, a couple questions. Do you think George Washington, if given a bigger opportunity, would have taken it? And if you look at Napoleon, there were a lot of events that conspired to kind of push him into empire mode. I mean, other countries were attacking him, other countries were refusing to adopt uh, his continental system, and England was pretty much hell bent on not letting him sit on the throne. So war had to happen. If things had happened a different way, do you think Napoleon would have been content with a role as King of France and maybe a slightly greater area around it? Just interested in your thoughts on that. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a subscriber, look at my titles. You'll find stuff you'll find interesting. In order to keep up with that, you should subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.